Just after 8 in the morning on August the 6th, 1945, a 26-year-old Army Air Forces captain sitting in the co-pilot seat of a B-29 bomber over southern Japan felt two shock waves roll through his aircraft in quick succession, 6 miles above a city he had just watched disappear beneath a column of fire and smoke. He picked up his personal notebook, the one he had been scribbling in throughout the flight, describing the mission almost minute by minute as it unfolded, and wrote down 5 words that would outlive him by decades. My God, what have we done? 43 seconds earlier, a bomb called Little Boy had left the belly of his aircraft, tumbling tail first before flipping nose down to fall in a long, near vertical line toward the city below. In those 43 seconds, it had fallen roughly 6 miles, and when it detonated, it killed somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people almost instantly. The opening act of a single morning that would eventually claim more than twice that number before the year was out. This is the story of 2 men who sat a few feet apart in the same cockpit for those same 43 seconds, watched the same fire, and spent the rest of their lives answering for it in completely opposite ways. Every week, we take apart a moment when a war turned, the people who made it happen, and the razor-thin margin between one version of history and another. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Paul Warfield Tibbets Jr. was born in February of 1915 in Quincy, Illinois, and grew up mostly in Miami, a medical student at the University of Cincinnati until he withdrew in 1937 to enlist in the Army Air Corps instead, trading a stethoscope for a cockpit years before anyone in Washington had begun seriously discussing what an atomic weapon might actually require to deliver. By 1944, Tibbets had already built a substantial combat record flying B-17s over North Africa and Europe, experience commanding heavy bombers under fire that helped make him the Army's choice to command the 509th Composite Group, a unit built from the ground up around a single, still secret purpose: delivering whatever weapon the Manhattan Project eventually produced, whenever that weapon was finally ready and whatever it eventually turned out to actually be. Tibbets was given an unusually wide mandate for a colonel, still in his 20s, personally selecting the specific B-29 that would carry that weapon off an assembly line in Omaha, Nebraska, part of a specially modified production run known as Silver Plate, aircraft stripped of unnecessary armor and armament and fitted with more powerful engines to save weight and gain altitude for a bomb. Nobody outside a small circle of cleared officers had yet been told the true size or nature of. He named the aircraft Enola Gay, after his own mother, and had the name freshly painted onto its nose just before the mission, a decision that infuriated the man who would fly beside him. That man was Captain Robert A. Lewis, 26 years old, the Enola Gay's regular co-pilot, and by most accounts considerably more attached to that particular aircraft and its regular crew than Tibbets himself was, having flown and trained with the same men for months before his commanding officer decided to take the controls for the mission that actually mattered. Lewis was reportedly furious when Tibbets, exercising his authority as the group's commanding officer, chose to fly the mission himself in what Lewis had come to think of as his own airplane, and angrier still when he first saw his commander's mother's name freshly stenciled across the nose without any advance warning, reportedly demanding to know what exactly the name was doing on his plane. The 2 men who would spend the morning of August the 6th sitting beside each other in the same cramped cockpit did not, by the available evidence, particularly like each other going into it, a personal tension that neither man ever fully resolved even decades after the mission that bound their names together for the rest of history. The Enola Gay took off from Ushi Point Airfield on Tinian Island in the early hours of August the 6th, part of a formation of 3 bombers making the run itself alongside 2 further observation aircraft already positioned near the target to record the results from a safe distance. A separate weather reconnaissance plane had gone ahead of the main formation, radioing back reports on conditions over several candidate cities before Tibbets received word midway through the flight that Hiroshima had been cleared as the primary target for that morning, its skies reported clear enough for a visual bombing run rather than the less accurate radar-guided drop the crew would have been forced to rely on had cloud cover obscured the city. The bomb itself had been armed only after the aircraft was already airborne, a deliberate safety precaution meant to reduce the risk of a catastrophic accident on the ground at Tinian, where thousands of ground crew and support personnel had no idea what kind of weapon was actually being loaded onto the aircraft parked among dozens of otherwise ordinary-looking B-29s. The weapon they carried that morning represented one of the largest, most secretive engineering efforts in American history up to that point, a program that had consumed roughly $2 billion and employed well over 100,000 people across dozens of the sites, without most of them ever learning what the final product would actually be used for, compartmentalized so thoroughly that entire factory floors full of workers spent years assembling components for a purpose kept from them entirely. Little Boy was a gun-type device, a design considered simple enough by the physicists who built it that it was never even test-fired before its combat use, an almost unthinkable gamble by any ordinary engineering standard, relying on one piece of enriched uranium fired down a gun barrel into a second piece to create the critical mass needed for a nuclear chain reaction. It weighed close to 10,000 pounds, nearly 5 tons of casing, wrapped around a payload of enriched uranium smaller by weight than many objects that would fit inside a household refrigerator, a strange mismatch between the physical size of the material actually doing the killing and the physical size of the machine built to deliver it. 3 B-29s flew the mission that morning, Enola Gay carrying the bomb itself, 2 others trailing behind carrying scientific instruments and photographic equipment to document whatever happened next, since nobody involved in the planning could say with total certainty what that would actually look like from 6 miles up, or whether the aircraft delivering it would even survive its own weapons blast. The bombing run itself unfolded with an almost bureaucratic precision that stood in stark contrast to what it was actually about to accomplish. As the aircraft neared the city that morning, a bridge chosen months earlier as the aim point, selected specifically for how easily it could be identified from high altitude, came into view through Bombardier Thomas Farabee's bomb site. A short countdown began, the crew running through a sequence they had rehearsed dozens of times over the preceding months without ever rehearsing it with a live weapon. Farabee called out that the bomb was away, and Little Boy dropped clear of the aircraft, which lurched upward several feet at the sudden loss of nearly 5 tons of weight, the airframe visibly reacting to a burden it had carried across a full ocean, finally leaving it. Tibbets immediately threw the Enola Gay into a sharp, practiced turn away from the target, a maneuver the crew had rehearsed for months, because they had been told they had less than a minute to put enough distance between themselves and the detonation to survive the shockwave that would follow, and nobody involved in designing the weapon could promise them with total confidence that even that would be enough. 43 seconds after release, Little Boy detonated high above the city, close enough to its intended aim point to be considered, in the sterile language of the after-action reports filed later, a highly successful strike. The fireball that followed expanded within a fraction of a second, ground temperatures near the point of detonation climbing high enough to fuse buildings together and vaporize anyone standing near the center of the blast before their bodies had time to register what was happening to them. A violence so total and so instantaneous that entire categories of physical evidence, entire people, simply ceased to exist in any recoverable form. Nearly a mile of the city below was leveled almost instantly, and beyond that immediate zone of total destruction, fires spread through wooden buildings across a much wider area, compounding the damage from the blast itself with a firestorm that burned for hours afterward. Estimates compiled by historians in the decades since place the immediate death toll, those killed within that first day, somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people, a number that continued climbing for months afterward as burns, radiation sickness, and the near total collapse of the city's medical infrastructure claimed further lives day after day, pushing the total toll by the end of 1945 towards somewhere between 140 and 200,000 people. Out of a city that had held roughly 350,000 residents, workers, and soldiers that same morning, a majority of them civilians with no direct connection to the military headquarters the target had originally been selected around. Inside the Enola Gay, the reaction to what the crew had just done split almost immediately along the same lines that had already separated Tibbets and Lewis before the mission even began. two men processing an identical 60 seconds of shared experience in almost entirely opposite emotional registers from the very first moment. Tibbets described what he saw with the detached technical language of a man cataloging an engineering result rather than processing a human catastrophe, later recalling that he had never been able to properly estimate beforehand what the explosion would actually look like, and that the mushroom cloud rising beneath them exceeded anything he or anyone else on the mission had privately imagined despite months of briefings and preparation. He would go on to describe the entire experience for the rest of a life that lasted another 62 years in almost exactly that same clinical register, saying decades later that he was not proud of having killed 80,000 people, but was proud of having planned and executed a mission that worked exactly as designed and maintaining consistently, in interview after interview across 6 subsequent decades, that he slept without difficulty and carried no regret whatsoever for his role in it. In one later interview, he framed his own reasoning in stark, unambiguous terms, saying he had known the mission would kill a great many people, but believed just as firmly that it would ultimately save a great many more by making a ground invasion of Japan unnecessary. Robert Lewis, sitting beside him through the entire flight, processed the same 43 seconds and the same fireball in a completely different register from the moment it happened. His journal entry, written in the immediate aftermath while the shock waves were still rolling through the aircraft, did not describe technical success. It asked in 5 words that historians and documentary makers have quoted more often than almost anything else connected to the mission, what exactly the crew had just done. In later years, Lewis would, like Tibbets, publicly defend the necessity of the mission and the war that had led to it, at one point stating plainly that he was pleased the bomb had never been used again since, but he never fully abandoned the emotional register of that first written reaction either, telling interviewers on more than one occasion that he doubted he would ever fully get those few minutes out of his mind for as long as he lived. A man who had watched the same fire from the same cockpit as his commanding officer and never quite managed to file it away with the same clinical distance his commanding officer somehow always seemed to carry. The wider crew reflected a similar split without ever resolving cleanly into 2 neat camps. Thomas Farabee, the bombardier who had physically released the bomb, reportedly spoke about the mission afterward mostly in terms of technical precision and professional execution. A seasoned airman who had already seen extensive combat over Europe before this mission and offered little in the way of public reflection on the human consequence either way in the decades that followed. Other crew members, interviewed decades later at reunions and for oral history projects, tended to describe their own reasoning in the plain, practical terms common to a generation that had already lived through years of brutal Pacific fighting, framing the bombing as the act that finally ended a war rather than as an act requiring separate moral accounting from everything that had come before it. One surviving crew member interviewed on the mission's 73rd anniversary put it about as plainly as any of them ever did, saying he did not regret what they had done that day, that all war was hell, and that Japan had started the war and it had simply been America's turn to finish it. None of the 12 men aboard Enola Gay that morning, so far as the historical record shows, ever fully agreed with each other about what exactly they should feel about the 43 seconds they had all shared, even decades afterward, at reunions where they continued gathering together well into old age. 3 days later, a second American bomb fell on the city of Nagasaki, killing an estimated 40,000 people in that first attack alone, and within a week, Japan had agreed to surrender, ending the Second World War on terms that avoided the full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands American military planners had been actively preparing for, an invasion some official projections estimated could have cost hundreds of thousands of additional American and Japanese lives had it gone forward on top of the roughly 300,000 Japanese civilians who had already died from conventional bombing raids and wartime starvation before either atomic weapon was ever used. That calculation, the argument that the bombs, however catastrophic, prevented a still larger catastrophe still to come, became the foundation of the justification Tibbets and most of his surviving crewmates would repeat for the rest of their lives, a position historians have continued to debate ever since, weighing the documented invasion planning and casualty projections against separate, equally serious historical arguments about whether Japan's surrender was already close at hand through other pressures, diplomatic and military, entirely apart from the atomic bombs themselves by August of 1945. Both positions rest on real, documented evidence. Neither fully resolves what the people standing beneath the Aioi Bridge that particular morning actually lost in the 43 seconds before they even had time to look up. Paul Tibbets remained in the Air Force for another 2 decades, eventually retiring as a brigadier general in 1966, and spent the rest of his long life as the mission's most consistent, unyielding public defender, giving interview after interview across 6 subsequent decades, in which his account of that morning changed remarkably little from one telling to the next. He died in November of 2007 at 92 years old, having specifically requested no funeral and no headstone, worried, according to a close friend who spoke to reporters after his death, that any fixed grave marker would simply become a permanent site for protest by people who had spent decades condemning what he had done. His ashes were scattered over the English Channel by his widow rather than buried anywhere a visitor might one day come looking for a name to argue with. Robert Lewis died decades earlier, in 1983, having spent the intervening years giving his own occasional interviews and public talks about the mission, generally defending its necessity in the broad strokes his commanding officer always used, while never fully recapturing, at least on the public record, the flat, unshaken certainty Tibbets carried to his own grave that Lewis himself never actually seemed to possess in the same measure. The notebook Lewis wrote in that morning, the one containing his 5-word reaction, survived him by decades, later surfacing at public auction as one of the most sought-after primary documents connected to the entire mission, a single handwritten page selling long after his death for a price that treated his private moment of doubt as a piece of history worth owning in its own right, a market value his commanding officer's own lifelong certainty never quite generated in the same collector circles. This is not a story about which man on that flight deck had the correct reaction to what they had just done, and it is not a story that can settle, in the space of a single video, the much larger argument over whether the bombing itself was necessary, justified, or something considerably more complicated than either of those 2 words allow for. It is a story about how 2 people can sit close enough to touch each other, watch precisely the same fire rise over precisely the same city in precisely the same 43 seconds, and walk away from it having lived for the rest of their lives in 2 entirely different relationships with the same shared mourning, one man building a public identity around having felt nothing he needed to apologize for across 62 more years of interviews that never wavered, the other leaving behind 5 handwritten words that suggested, at least in that first unguarded moment, before he had time to compose a more considered public position, that he had felt something considerably harder to file away and never fully managed to. Today, the Enola Gay itself hangs fully restored at the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center outside Washington, its aluminum skin polished back to the same gleam it carried the morning it took off from Tinian, displayed for decades now, without the extended historical commentary and casualty context that curators had originally proposed for its 50th anniversary exhibit, and that veterans groups successfully fought to remove before the exhibit ever opened to the public, a compromise reached only after a bitter public dispute that still occasionally reopens the same argument. Tibbets and Lewis themselves never fully settled between each other in their own lifetimes. Somewhere in a private collection, Robert Lewis's own notebook, or at least the page bearing those 5 words, rests behind glass or inside an archival folder, the closest surviving physical trace of exactly what one man, sitting a few feet from another man who never doubted himself for a single day afterward, actually felt in the 43 seconds between a bomb leaving an aircraft and a city of 350,000 people disappearing beneath it. If you want more stories about the people who lived the rest of their lives inside a single, irreversible moment, subscribe and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.